Hello, everybody. My name is Chase Gillespie, a site historian at the Edison Ford Winter Estates. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to our digital step in history presentation on the Tin Goose, the history of the Ford Trimotor. If you have any questions during the presentation, put them in the chat, and in the end, I will look it over and answer some of them. But now, to simply start with Ford Trimotors, the fact is, got to start with, well, there you go, Kitty Hawk. 1903, the first controlled powered aerial flight. And I say that in this like weird context just because man flew before in balloons, on gliders, parachutes. But if you think of modern aircraft, which another definition I've seen has simply been the first heavier than air powered flight. And this actually sparked Henry Ford's interest as in terms of commercial aviation, as flying people and cargo across the country, maybe across the world, and make a quick buck. But there was already competition, something Henry Ford had a bit of a keener eye on, and that was airships. The fact is, the photo on the left shows a photo from 1909. You see a Zeppelin, a sailboat, and a modern at the time cargo ship. Pretty cool photo right there. And Henry Ford had sent men to Germany to study Zeppelins, and also was it possible to build them in America and actually make a decent profit for his business. The thing is, though, they cost too much money. It was estimated by Henry Ford it would cost $1 million per airship, but he did invest in some infrastructure. The photo on the right actually shows a mooring mast built at the Ford Airport in Dearborn, and it was basically a place you could tie off your airship and bring down people and cargo here and there. It was one of the first in the world at the time and one of the few private ones. It was ahead of its time, but by the 1920s and 30s, it had fallen behind, and by the 40s had been torn down. So sadly, you can't see it anymore. Now, moving on to, sadly, the First World War, which, sad for Henry Ford, is simply more conflict, but good for the aviation industry as planes were now seen as carrying bullets and bombs. Could they also carry cargo, people, transport? And this right here, I believe, is an American pilot and a British aircraft right here in the photograph. And Henry Ford, his interest was sparked again as simply, could I take away the guns, take away a bit of the metal plating, and make it quicker, faster, and cheaper, which was actually seen by the United States Postal Service. This is actually an aircraft they bought during the First World War. So it is an option. But Henry Ford, he's not biting just yet. He's biding his time, waiting for a better opportunity. And that was found with William Stout, who's actually born on March 16th, 1880. He passed away on March 20th, 1956. He produced the first all-metal airplane in the United States, and it was in 1922, a full metal bomber for the United States Navy. He would become an executive at the Ford Motor Company, and later on designed the aircraft that would become the Ford Trimotor. And that's due to the fact is, in 1924, William Stout founded the Stout All-Metal Airplane Company, funded in part by the elites of Detroit, which included Edsel Ford. And the 2AT you can see right here was a single-engine all-metal aircraft. It's not a trimotor just yet, as trimotor means having three engines. And Henry Ford, why he wanted those so much, so if one engine went out, you have two left. You have spares. And this did get some claim to fame. The fact is, William Stout would sell one of these planes to the United States Postal Service, as in October of 1924. One of these planes actually got into an accident. It fell to the ground. It crashed into a farm, but all 10 occupants survived, which included an aeronautical professor from MIT who was actually on the board to verify should the United States Postal Service buy one of these planes. Well, since he survived, no one was hurt, he said, why not just buy the plane? So the Postal Service paid William Stout $25,000. And Henry Ford thinks this is it. This is the best design around. We can make money, and also it's safe because aircraft have a bit of an image issue, which I will approach later on. So, August 1st, 1925, Henry Ford bought the Stout All-Metal Airplane Company for $1.3 million. The price was so high as simply to buy out any investors in the airplane company. He would pay any investor who paid $1 for Stout $2 back, just to make sure he had full control of the company. And you can see right here, this photo of William Stout on the left and Henry Ford on the right. He's got his control. He is an engineer, and he still, though, needs to work out a few kinks. And one of those issues, like I said earlier, was image. as at the time, there's an event called barnstorming, and it's the practice of stunt flying and offering airplane rides. It was seen in rural communities, and it was a majority of at-home mechanics and also pilots from the First World War who could not take their British and French planes home, so they built their own or tried to buy them abroad. And as you can see from these photographs, first one on the left, actually a poster. They would do mock dogfights in the sky, recreating the First World War. And on the right, actually see they're actually racing cars on the ground. This showed off aviation brought to the rest of the country as something exciting, but also was pretty dangerous, as these pilots never really had any certifications, neither to the machinery, the equipment, the planes themselves. It was only until 1926 the Air Commerce Act actually had regulations for pilots, aircraft, and air commerce as a whole. So they're very dangerous. This Air Act, though, was pushed by Ford, even though Ford is seen as anti-government in some aspects. He wanted the commercial aviation industry to be safe and at a good place where he'd actually start making his own planes, make some more money. And the danger was real. By 1925, there were 600 barnstormers across the country, and some of them did sadly pass away. An example, in one 2-week period in New York, 2 planes disintegrated midair. They did not crash, they literally fell apart in the skies because these planes from the First World War, made of canvas and fabric, they are old, maybe some at least like 10 years old. It wasn't worth it. Henry Ford could build his own plane, and he did so with the 3AT. Now, this is a modified 2AT with 3 Wright J4 engines, and it was first flown on November 24th, 1925, and it was a disaster. The fact is, the plane could not carry enough, it was slow to climb, and also could not really slow down quick enough when landing. And Henry Ford is quoted as saying that the first time in my life I have bought a lemon, and I don't want the world to know of it. So, the airplane factory that Ford started, well, it burnt to the ground on January 17th, 1926, and all 3 AT models were destroyed. Did Henry Ford cause the fire? We don't know. The fact is, though, he did lose money. He lost the 3 ATs, and he's looking back to the drawing boards. He needs to build a plane that started from Ford, as the 2 AT, remember, was from Stout, from the all-metal airplane company he had just bought. Needs something of his own. And he would find that in the 4 AT, which rolled out June 11th, 1926. 3 Wright J04 engines, a 12-passenger capacity. 78 were made. It was the most produced planes of the Ford Motor Company, one of the most. And it was very easy to modify. As an example, if you look at the plane, the cockpit is actually open because pilots, in case the plane stalled out, they could jump out in time and save themselves. But Henry Ford wanted to change that, and he added improvements. He did have about 35 patents in commercial aviation, which were all free to the public, which was Henry Ford once more propping up the entire industry as a whole to encourage more clients, more competition, and more people flying. And you see the 4 AT right here on the Ford runway. It has a closed cockpit, so pilots don't jump out. The fact is, there's no fear of that now crashing. The engines are better. And also at the back, there's a tail wheel. That's actually pretty important, as planes before then, to taxi onto the runway, had to be towed by other cars and tractors, which took a bit of time. But the 4 AT, you could move on your own power. And these were pretty important, especially at the Ford Airport. It was one of the few airports in the world at the time, actually the first in the world in 1926, to actually have a paved runway. It was only until 1936 in Switzerland they had concrete runways in other countries besides the United States. So he's really innovating ahead of his time. And here's a photo of one of the many uses of the 4 AT, actually a grocery run. You see actually some children in costume checking it out. The fact is they weren't just made for moving mail or people. You could move groceries, cargo, and other items. So another way to make some money. And also, you could actually still move people. And here are your chairs. They're wicker chairs bolted to the floor to save on weight. And the aircraft industry is still in its infancy, especially commercial aviation. It's going to take some time to get a bit more comfy. So for the time, flying is a novelty, and all you got were wicker chairs. But now to a gentleman who helped change the aircraft industry, and especially Ford's image, was Richard Byrd. He was a lieutenant in the United States military, He led two expeditions, which were noteworthy to this presentation: a 1926 polar expedition to the North Pole in the Josephine Ford, and a 1929 Antarctic expedition to the South Pole in the Floyd Bennett. And the Josephine Ford is actually in the back of the photo, the one on the left. And Richard Byrd is pretty important as Edsel Ford gave him a lot of money. In 1926, Edsel Ford gave Richard Byrd $20,000, and John D. Rockefeller Jr., he matched it, so also gave him $20,000. And in 1929, the fact is he gave Richard Byrd $100,000, and John D. Rockefeller, once again, he matched it. So a lot of money. That's also why the 26th plane was named the Josephine Ford, which you can see this photograph right here, currently in the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Thing is, though, it is not a Ford aircraft. It was made by Fokker in Germany, and it was one of the only companies at the time that also made all-metal airplanes. And Richard Byrd did intend to use a 3AT for the trip. The thing is, though, the factory burnt to the ground. They had no airplane, so he had to go to Fokker. But still, named it Josephine Ford after Edsel Ford's daughter to honor him for all the contributions. But moving on to the 1929 expedition. This is, you can see in the background, the Floyd Bennett was a 4AT trimotor, was used in the 1929 expedition, and was recovered in 1935. You can still see it today in the Ford Museum. It is named the Floyd Bennett after the 1926 pilot who sadly passed away in 1928, trying to save some pilots who had crashed in Canada. So Richard Byrd, to honor his former pilot, named the plane after him. And it was heavily modified, had celluloid windows, a thinner skin, larger gas tanks, as the fuel capacity increased from 235 gallons to 745. A big jump. And also had skis and a larger engine. Simply longer flights, and also the Antarctic, a little rougher on the aircraft. And I do a photo. The fact is, remember, he abandoned this plane after the expedition in the ice, 1935. Edsel Ford actually sent a crew down there to actually see if the plane was okay. It was intact, had little to no damage, so Edsel decided to box it up in 25 crates, sent back up north to the museum, which you can still see today. Pretty astounding. Now, moving on once again, got to innovate. And this is the 5AT. Was built in July of 1928. 3 Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines, 1,200 horsepower, double that of the 4AT. It can carry 14 passengers, 2 more than the 4AT, so it's a little better. And also, 119 were built. This is the most produced aircraft of the Ford Motor Company. And the last one was sold in 1933. And these were actually flown by commercial airlines on the regular till the 1950s in South America, because the 5AT was famous for not needing a long runway. In the South America, in the mountains, don't have really a big airfield, so the 5AT is good enough. And the 5AT was heavily modified over time. The fact is, later aircraft, you hear, the fact is, give me an example. Actually, jump ahead right here. This is the 5AT-116. Has skis, but also, like, why has it got a different name? That's because different engine combinations. The 6AT, 11, 12, 13, simply a 4AT or 5AT airframe with different engines. That's really the biggest difference. And since I jumped ahead a little bit, jump back once more. This actually shows passengers being taxied to the airfield, getting into a 5AT. And also just look at what they're walking on. Airfields for the majority were nothing but grass, which was really bad for the Ford aircraft as they were all metal. They were heavy and able to taxi themselves. They would tear up these runways. They would turn into mud and sludge. But you have to make do, and not a lot of people had the same money as Ford to actually pave their airfields. Now, to a bit more on advertisement for Henry Ford. He would start the National Air Reliability Tours, a series of air races across the United States from 1925 to 1931. Thing is, though, he did win 3 of them, I believe, in 1925, 1930, and 1931. But even though he won those races, it was never the point. It was simply to advertise, showing that aircraft were safe and a commercial option to travel across the country and travel in style. 1925, the first race, saw 17 planes from 11 manufacturers participate. and the largest air tour was actually in 1928. It was over 6,000 miles in less than a month. And that race, the fact is, give an example of where they went. It started in Dearborn, Michigan. They went to San Antonio, Texas, to San Diego, California, then Tacoma, Washington, then back to Dearborn. That's a trip right there. And also, if you won, you would see the photo to the right, the Etzelby Ford Reliability Tour Trophy, made of silver, looks pretty nice. And to show you the actual airport during the race, there's actually a photo taken in 1930. See all the contestants and their planes lined up. And they would not simply race these planes. They would have companies there showing off their aircraft, their parts, and also once more, it's the advertisement, showing this is a safer option, not as dangerous as seen with the barnstormers and doing mock dogfights in the sky. But now, to something a bit more experimental. I only made one of these. This is the XB-906 bomber. And this came out due to the United States military wanting their own combat aircraft developed by Ford. He had sold 5 ATs to the United States military, but they were all transport planes. And they asked, could you build a bomber? And so basically tacked on some new engines, a couple of guns, and a bomb bay, but it was not good enough. As was a modified 5 ATD, it had a higher flight ceiling, a faster top speed, but it was also a lot heavier. It was rejected by the Army Air Corps as it was not very aerodynamic. It was a bit too slight landing, a bit too quick, and the guns didn't have proper angles to shoot from, so being in combat would be a bit of a risk. It was destroyed on September 19th, 1931, in a plane crash. The fact is, one of the motors exploded during a power dive. And sad to say, Ford's chief test pilot, Leeward Manning, and his flight mechanic, I will actually try to say his name properly, Lycurgus Garriott, sadly passed away in the incident. But to another experimental plane that Ford developed was the 14AT, this monstrosity. It was built in 1932. It was only capable of carrying 32 passengers, which nowadays can carry a few hundred. Still astounding for the time. As Henry Ford wanted to build this in 1927, even that early, he wanted a plane capable of carrying at least 100 passengers. It can only carry 32, only one was made, and it never flew. It did move on the runway on its own power, but never flew in the air. And it did cost $1 million pre-assembly before it was built. Just the parts alone cost $1 million. And it was powered by 3 Hispano-Suiza engines, generating 1,000 horsepower. Now, a couple more photos to give a more in-depth example. And it could reach, it was estimated to reach a cruising speed of 150 miles per hour and at a gas capacity of 500 gallons. The thing is, though, it would guzzle 121 gallons an hour. So cutting down on range severely, your flight's not going to be that long. But it was seen as an idea of a lap of luxury flight. They would have smoking galleys. They would have buttons in every compartment to call out staff. And your chairs could fold down to be beds. So he's thinking ahead of his time. Once again, it was simply not worth it. He would eventually salvage the plane, tear it down to scraps, except he would save one engine, and it would be used at the Ford Airport in Dearborn as a wind tunnel to test out race cars. So part of it survived, but it's too early. He's got to wait a few decades. But now, jumping ahead, 1929. There's a little issue. Thanks to hindsight, the Great Depression. As this photo right here actually shows the Ford aircraft factory, building them in the sense as you see with the Model Ts up in the Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. But 1929, sales were recorded, or should have been, 25,000 planes sold annually. They only sold 5,500. And stocks are still rising. So the actual product being sold is not matching the stock prices. So eventually there'll be a correction. And that was the Great Depression. Actually, a photo of the the New York Stock Exchange just after the Great Depression happened or started. And the crash hit hard with 46 aircraft company stocks plummeting 56% between May and November of 1929, and commercial aircraft sales actually dropped 80%. And the peak Ford aircraft production of 25 planes in June of 1929, well, by August of 1932, the factory was shut down. And they did keep staff there at the Ford aircraft plant until 1933. And by 1936, though, everybody was evacuated. They went to the Rouge plant. Actually, see right here, this photograph of the Rouge. They continued to make aircraft parts, until the late 1940s. And by then, it's over. The Ford Trimotor, it was nice while it lasted, but Henry Ford, he's left the market. But Henry Ford's a big fish in a small pond. When he leaves, who takes his place? Well, Douglas and Boeing. See left and right. Or the fact is, Boeing would eventually buy Douglas. But people still like to fly. Fact is, 1925, there were about 6,000 people flying annually across the world. By 1931, 450,000. There's still a market. It's still jumping up, and planes are getting safer. So Douglas and Boeing, there's no more competition. Ford had left. He had been a real mover and shaker. Back as remember, though, 35 aircraft patents. They were free to the public. They could improve their aircraft and also continue the commercial aviation industry. And Henry Ford, it is argued by some historians the best thing he ever did for the aviation industry was simply talk about it. Advertisement. He had over 100 ads for commercial aviation. So the Ford Trimotor might have impact, but it was really Henry Ford's word and also the money he shelled out. And with that, this is the end of my presentation. In part, here are some of my sources. Here are the websites I used. The Facebook group, the Facebook page, simply from the United States Air Force Museum, only place I could get the XB-906 bomber photos, so that's why it's there. And also some of the books I used. Fact is, Timothy O'Callaghan, pretty good author. I do recommend him if you want to learn more about the Ford Airport or the aviation legacy of Edsel and Henry, the Fords. Thank you all for tuning into my presentation. Hope to see you all next month, and have a good rest of your day.